Hey, what's going on, people? I know it's been a minute. I know. But as you all know, I'm relatively new to the podcast scene. So, one of the biggest things I have to do is find the time. However, I got a little extra time now. So, I want to go ahead and do a quick video. And to be honest with you, I've actually done a couple of videos since my last one, but I wasn't too impressed with the quality of it. And another thing that I didn't, that I had concerns about was I was thinking I was talking about too deep of topics way too soon. So what I want to do is before I get to those topics, I want to kind of build up so we can kind of build a path to where we need to go. And part of doing that is finding a common point of reference. And by that, I mean, I want to explain where I'm coming from. Uh, and in order to do that, the best thing for me to do is do some book recommendations because I don't want to say I'm an avid reader, but I do read a lot. And of course, my point of view and outlook on things come a lot from the stuff that I read. And one of the things about me is I like reading stories. I like reading books from people that are smarter than me. I like to be able to absorb that knowledge because I don't have the time or the energy to go for my PhD or my doctorate or any of those other things. So what I want to do is just read from the people that have already accomplished that, and save myself some time. And I'm gonna just get the cliff notes in book form. Another thing I like about books is at the end they give you references. So if you read something in the book and you're like, I don't know about that. That sounds suspect. Well, you can go to their reference and check them out and see where they got the information, and you can decide that way. Without further ado, I want to go through a few books that I have here because if you know me, you know one of the things that one of the topics that I'm constantly talking about is reparations. And in order to understand reparations, you have to understand history, American history to be specific. And so there's a lot of books out there and a lot of information, and I get that, but I've actually saved you the time of having to read all the books, and I got a few recommendations. I call it my reparations book pack. Let's call it that. However, these are books, and it's actually quite a few. Look like I got. Looks like I got like 11 books to recommend. Of course, I know that you're not going to be able to read all of them in one sitting. These are just book recommendations, just in general. Most of the books are less than 300 pages. So if you could just dedicate 10, and this is, of course, if you're not an avid reader, but even if you're not a reading person, you can dedicate just 10 pages a day to it. And you'll be finished with the book in a month. So, I mean, those are just some options if you need some suggestions. But without further ado, let's get to the first book. First book I have to recommend, The Half Has Never Been Told. I just want to make sure I get this in here. Y'all tell me if it's backwards. You know I can't tell. But anyway, the book is The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptiste. Uh, I like this book because, of course, it details slavery and how money was made and things like that. However, it doesn't just talk about uh, the ways we were exploited. Of course, that's the main part, but it also tells you some pretty interesting things about slave life that kind of sheds a life and lets you know that even though we were in bondage, one thing about black people is we always know how to make the best of a bad situation. And so, like I said, one of the things it talks about in here is how a lot of black music was started, of course, with the spirituals. However, from there, the slaves would sometimes have like these jam sessions in their quarters after hours where they would be making music. And one of the things that the black American slaves developed was in music was the improvisation, where basically you just jamming and then one person does a solo for however long. That didn't exist before we created it, and I think that's pretty awesome. Uh, and that's just one of the stories. It also talks about how uh, we like to think that slaves were just subservient and docile. Yes, you did have some runaways, but it was minor. But the fact is, that's not true. If you know anything about slave life, you know that it's basically unlivable to a certain extent. And this book mentions that. It mentions how many slaves actually fought back, how many slaves actually ran away, the different opportunities they had to run away, and some of them took it. Um, a lot of times with slaves, they would uh, have certain quotas that they have to meet as far as picking cotton and things like that, and so they had all kind of different little scams that kind of fool their masters, whether it be putting rocks in the bag to kind of make it seem heavier, or sometimes certain slaves would get finished first and they would help some of the slower ones. See, this is the stuff they don't teach us in school, but it's important to know that yes, we were slaves. However, a lot of us found ways to uh, kind of game the system, if you will. And I think that's magnificent. That's stuff I like to hear. That I think if more people knew how slaves use their brain to kind of outsmart their master, it would help us think about slavery in a slightly different way. Let them know that, hey, yes, we were in bondage, but we were still using our brains to outsmart people who thought that we wasn't even human. So like I said, that's something to check out. Oh, and another thing I thought was interesting about the books, kind of going back uh, to music. This talks about in one of the chapters. It talks about how slaves, in order to meet such a high quota, such a high amount of cotton to pick per day, you basically had to learn how to use two hands at once. So sure, you might be right-handed, but in order to pick cotton and do everything, you had to learn to be equally as good with both hands. And one of the reasons I bring that up is and this is my personal opinion. I'm not a doctor or anything like that, but I think that that's why you have so many black people that are good with their hands, whether it be playing an instrument. Usually an instrument requires you to be doing two things at once. Aside from the other, so playing the piano, saxophone, drums, all these different things where you got to have two hands doing two different things. Yeah, that I think that is our ancestors give to us. Like I said, sports too. Usually, for instance, basketball. A lot of times, in order to be good dribbling the ball, you got to know how to dribble with two hands. So, like I said, that I share that because you'd be surprised what you can do if you ever just kind of learn the different craft. As you all know, I do crochet. Requires two hands, but even on a lower level, I also play the bass guitar, learning acoustic as we speak, and both of those require two hands. And so I know with my personal life, I like to just test myself to see, okay, what new can I learn. However, I would suggest that to you. If you have something that you always kind of wanted to do and was like, I don't know. Well, it's in our DNA. It's in our DNA to know how to use two hands at once. So before you talk yourself out of another hobby, I would say try that. So that's enough on this book. Like I said, it is pretty thick. Actually, I think this one might even be more than 300 pages. However, this will be one of the few books where that applies, but it's a great read. So make sure you check that out. That's what the cover looks like. And what's the next book? They Were Her Property. A lot similar to the last book. However, this book details white women as slave owners in the American South. And the author is Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. You can see that at the bottom. Black woman. You did your thing on this one. Hashtag, by the way. Like I said, it's like the last book, except this focuses on the white women slave owners. A lot of times when you hear feminists talk historically, they leave this part out. They make it seem like it was just a white man thing and the white women was just going along with it because they was married and all this other kind of stuff. But this book kind of lets us know that's not exactly the case. A lot of times the white women knew good and well what their husbands was doing with the slaves. Some women even went with them to purchase slaves. Some women even went to purchase slaves without being accompanied by a man. As you can see, this on the cover, they're actually in court because sometimes women had to sue to get their property. People, by the way, when they say property. And so, this is a very eye-opening book for those of us who look at women, white women specifically, as just these tender-hearted, well-meaning, just ultimately good people. We know that historically that wasn't the case, but even when we fast forward till now, we know that that's not the case. Not saying that all white women are bad. I think I may even have a couple of books with white women authors to recommend. So I'm not saying that all white women are bad. However, I think white women would tell you, like, yeah, we got some issues though. I mean, let's not forget, I always share this this statistic: 53% of white women, they voted for Trump instead of another white woman. I don't understand that, but that's how they go. So, like I said, you have a lot of allegiance to white supremacy, and this book really details that. It details how brutal some of the white slave masters that were female, how they could be, because they would have to overcompensate to show, like, hey, we mean business. Don't just treat me different because I'm a white woman. I can be just as evil and just as brutal as a white man. And it's true. It's detailed in here. There's a chapter on wet nursing that's very very visceral, when you read it. However, I think it's necessary to learn these things and learn about history, because feminism has tried to convince some of our black women that black men are the enemy. Okay, like somehow black men benefit from having a penis. We know that's not true, but feminism likes to convince some of our sisters that that's the case. And if you do think that black men are the enemy and that we're the ones that you have to worry about, I recommend this book. And I'll leave it at that. Slavery by Another Name. Apparently this book has won the Pulitzer Prize. That, usually awards and things like that doesn't factor in with me. However, for some people, I know it may. So I just wanted to put that out. But yeah, Slavery by Another Name by Douglas A. Blackman, who's actually a white man. This is a white guy that wrote this book, but it doesn't make it any less relevant. This book talks about the re-enslavement of black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. So this book is basically about Jim Crow. Which is basically Jim Crow laws were after the slaves were freed. White people were trying to figure out, well, how do we get them to work for free again? We know it's illegal now, but how do we get them to work for free? So what they would do is they would pass laws that would disproportionately get black people locked back up, because a part of our Constitution says slavery is actually legal if you're in prison. So that just made people think, like, well, how do we get these black guys into prison? So that's when you start to get some of these laws that are just very arbitrary, and for whatever reason they only apply to black people. And this is actually the beginning of mass incarceration, locking people up for bull crap. Yep, like I said, you would get this book details how black men would just get caught up just for one of the bigger ones is vagrancy, getting locked up, getting locked up for vagrancy, which is basically vagrancy is just hanging out, not not being at home but not working, just hanging out. That's vagrancy right there. And black men would get locked up, and once we got locked up, we didn't not necessarily on a plantation, but we would end up doing free labor. In this book, they detail it centers in Alabama, so it talks about how a lot of the prisoners would end up working in caves, mining for various materials that the owner of those mines could then turn around and make money off of while the guy's still in jail. And keep in mind, most of the reason why these guys was locked up, it wasn't because of crack. It wasn't because of drugs. It wasn't anything like that. They were basically finding all kind of reasons to pass bullcrap laws just to get folks locked up. And then, even at that, you would find white people that would be doing the same crimes, but they wouldn't go to jail. This book details that, but slavery by another name is pretty self-explanatory. If you ever hear people talking about Jim Crow laws or anything like that, and you weren't exactly sure, well, what exactly is Jim Crow? This is a good book to read. This one's a little thick too. This one looks like it's about 400 pages. I know I said most of them were under 300 pages, and I meant that. However, these first couple seems like they're a little bit, but it's worth it. This is an excellent book. This is one of those books that actually make you want to turn the page and read more. So I would recommend that one. However, if you're kind of new to black history and things like that, you may want to go in order. And I recommend all the books, but that last book is pretty awesome. Here's another one. How the Irish Became White. This is a good book because depending on where you live at, you may or may not work with or live around people of different origins. By origins, I mean they may come from different countries. So you may have some friends that come from Ireland. You may have some friends that come from Italy. All these different kind of places. And I know with me, because I'm so political, I generally attract people who are also political, which is not a problem because I think it's good to kind of know where other people come from. And by I say come from, I mean mentally, like where they're coming from. And so, like I said, I find myself around a lot of people who like to debate and discuss and all these different things, which I can appreciate. And but one of the things that I tend to come across is you'll hear people with lineage that traces back to Ireland or Italy. Those two specifically, they'll tend to hit you off with the, well, in Ireland or in Italy, we were the N-words of Europe. And I don't necessarily disagree with that aspect, but I generally focus on what happened when you actually came to this country. Okay, because sure, when you first got here, there was some discrimination there. People from Ireland were discriminated against. People from Italy was discriminated against. However, it's not like being on a plantation, though. It's not like it's not like being locked up for absolutely no reason. And so this book here is talking about how Irish people went from being discriminated against to being welcomed into society. Like you don't hear people suing other people because they got discriminated against because they were Irish. They may have certain prejudices and things like that, but you don't come across many stories where somebody didn't get a home because they were Irish or someone didn't get a home because they were Italian. You don't hear stories like that. And that's because America figured out a way to welcome in these groups so they can further oppress black people. And so in order to do that, you need to have numbers. So America had to make decisions. Which groups do we want to allow into the American life, and which groups do we want to exclude? Well, we already exclude black people. If we do that, we don't have to change anything. Let's let these Irish people in. Let's give them some money so they can start some neighborhoods. Let's give them some jobs. Let's make them the police. That way they have somebody to beat on when they need to release some tension. It's a win-win for everybody, but black people. So anyway, this is a good book because if you're ever having one of those woke discussions, you're inevitably going to come across somebody that's going to tell you how bad Irish people have it. So when you read this book, it'll give you some things to kind of combat that, because that is a common argument. And once again, I'm not saying that Irish people haven't experienced a level of discrimination, but they try to present it like it's the same as what black people go through, and that's actually not accurate. So, like I said, How the Irish Became White, Noel Ignatieff. Ooh, I don't know if I pronounced that name right, but I tried. And I would check that out. Oh, here's another book. When Affirmative Action Was White. When Affirmative Action Was White by, oh, here goes another name. Ira Kratzelson. Sorry about that, sir. But like I said, your name's hard to pronounce. But this is also a good book. Right here in small letters, An Untold History of Racial Inequality in the 20th Century. This book talks about the New Deal. After the Great Depression in the 1920s, the president, Roosevelt at the time, he wanted to kickstart the economy. And so he had quite a few government assistance programs that were supposed to, like I said, kickstart the economy. And so you have the New Deal, and you have other programs like the GI Bill that were given to Americans, or were supposed to be for Americans, to help them get a leg up and get financially stable. And a lot of that came from low to no interest home loans, just giving out land, giving out business loans, things like that traditionally help stabilize a failing or falling economy. So we have those different programs that were given out, and they were supposed to be for all Americans. However, during the time, you had gross segregation, gross prejudice. And unfortunately, the people that were in charge of these programs were white people. So when you're determining who gets these benefits, black people were excluded most of the time. It's just true, especially here in the South. You have, like I said, you have these racist white people that are decision makers, are gatekeepers, so you can apply for it as a black person during the time, but chances are you wouldn't get it because, like I said, you that's how racism works. You exclude people, and so a lot of these benefits that were given out, and like I said, they call it affirmative action because they're government programs. The ones they don't want us to have now, like how nobody wants to hand out those reparations because it's a handout, it's an entitlement. It's things like that. Yeah, nobody was saying that back then. So this is, like I said, this is a wonderful book. It shows how black people have been left out of certain government programs, which basically led to the wealth gap that we're seeing now. Like I said, with the GI Bill, when you get back from war, from serving time in the military, you're supposed to get free money to go to college. Well, that only works if you can get admitted into college. But if your college is segregated and they're not admitting black people, well, then obviously you can't go to college for free. Sure, you could go to HBCUs, but the seating was limited there. So you still have a lot of people that are locked out. And those guys that were locked out, and those guys and ladies who were locked out of these government programs, they have nothing to pass down to their children. And as we've discussed before, wealth gets it gets passed down. We like to think like, oh, everybody just earn it through hard work and sweat, which I mean that helps, but really wealth gets passed down. So the best way to ensure success in life is to already have it. Good luck with that. Wonderful book though, because a lot of times I know with black people, we get accused of mooching off of America with food stamps, EBT, stuff like that, Section 8, and people make it seem like, oh well, we're lazy, we're living off the government, we don't want to work, all these other things, but nobody was saying that back then. So once again, this is a great book. Keep in mind, I know that you're not going to be able to read all of these at once. These are just meant for casual reading. May take you a few months, may take you a year. As long as you read them, you're good. So like I said, When Affirmative Action Was White, excellent book. That's great water. The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. This book is about redlining. If you can see right there, there's a little red. See, that's like the blueprint of a lot of, I forget which particular city this is. Does it say? Doesn't say on here, but in a lot of your metro cities, you have areas where black people are designated to live, and they're usually in these red districts. What separate these red districts from other districts is usually these red districts are on bad land, near factories. They're basically not where you would choose to live. It's where you would live if you had no choice. And so this is a great book that talks about redlining and how cities and banks would basically work together to keep black people from experiencing that American dream, quote unquote. And I'm talking about black people who could afford to live in suburbs, in white areas where you might have a black doctor, black banker, someone who's managed to overcome, someone who's managed to do everything that white society tells us they want black people to do, and that we don't. Even when you're black and you do those things, you still get discriminated against. And this book talks about that, because we know having a home is a way to build wealth. But if you can't get a home loan, you can't create wealth. If you can only get a loan for bad property, sure, you might be a homeowner, but if it's on bad land, what it's not a benefit to you. You see what I'm saying? And this book is crazy because it shows the lengths that these neighborhoods would go to prevent black people from moving in. And on the off chance that a black person did get a home loan in a suburban neighborhood, the neighbors would keep up all wrecking and just make the environment so hostile that the families would just move. Like, you would go into it thinking like, well, if I could just show them that, I go to work every day and I'm a good person and I go to church and I pay my tax. If I could just prove myself to them, maybe they'll accept me. And a lot of people come to find out, no, your skin is your sin. It's not nothing else. We don't want black people around us. And once again, some people have to learn the hard way. So this is a great book about redlining. Just another instance of black people not being able to enjoy the fruits of being American, even though our ancestors fought in all the wars, even though our free labor is what created the system that we all enjoy, yet and still here we are, still getting locked out. And these are things that you don't learn in school. I mean, maybe depending on what school you go to. I didn't learn it. I didn't learn it in school, and I went to a pretty good school, so I don't know. But like I said, about 99% of the black history I've learned was on my own. So here we are. The Color of Law. Excellent book. Um, The Color of Money by Mercer Baradon. Oh, I'm sorry, Baradaran. I may not have said that right. I actually follow her on Twitter. She says her name is Phonic, so just sound it out and you'll probably say it right. I was rushing and I panicked a little bit, so if I messed up her name, I'm sorry. And if you see this video, I'm sorry. I panicked. So, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. Excellent book. Excellent book. Um, and it just talks about, and many of us have probably heard recommendations about, hey, we need to start a black bank so we can recycle the black dollar and this, that, and the other, which is a good strategy. The problem is that black people alone, we don't have enough money collectively to sustain a black bank. Uh, what do I mean? So, as many of you know, black people tend to live paycheck to paycheck, which means that when you get paid, a lot of times you're broke the day before you get paid again. And so when you live like that, you can't keep your money in the bank. So you may have a bank account in a black bank, but it doesn't really do any good if you have to take all of it right back out. See, black banks flourish when their customers put the money in and leave it in for a while. You leave it in so they can make business loans, home loans that they can get interest payments and make profit off of. Yeah, that's how you sustain a bank. Just putting money in and then immediately taking it out. Sure, you can have the benefit of saying, I use a black bank, but it doesn't benefit the bank anything. You see what I'm saying? And so this book talks about that, and it also talks about how banks of other groups were propped up by the government, whether it be Italian banks, whether it be Chinese banks, different nationalities in the formation of our current society. They were given all these kind of help by the government to uh, help sustain their bank, help them become successful to the point where they won't need the assistance. But you still need that influx at the beginning, especially when you start from nothing. And black people, after the Civil War, we started with nothing. When we got when we got our freedom, we got nothing else. No kind of help, no kind of nothing. So sure, we tried to start banks, but once again, without the infrastructure, a lot of them couldn't sustain themselves. And so historically, it's been hard to keep black banks open and profitable. And this book details that. And a lot of the stuff, I'll be honest, is a little complicated because I'm not real big. I'm not real great with numbers. If the revolution requires mathematics, I will not be an asset to the cause. However, like I said, if you are into numbers, if you understand interest rates and things like that, this is a good book. And don't get me wrong. I mean, you don't have to be a banker to understand it, but I think it would help. And if you're into real estate, if you're into finance and things like that, you should check it out and a lot of times we may read self-help books, whether it be financial literacy, how to invest, how to buy real estate, things like that. But you can't take out the race factor. And I know we hate talking about race and that it filters through our entire life, but we can't do that. That's why a lot of us fail in our endeavors, because we're trying to look at life from a white person's lens, and we can't do that. Black people have different circumstances. There's things that we have to worry about that no one else has to worry about. And so, like I say, that's why when we get our knowledge, we need to make sure it centers around being black. It centers around race, because if it's just all lives matter book, it's probably not going to be helpful to us. But The Color of Money, excellent book. Oh, getting close to the end, people. Real quick, Claude Anderson, Black Labor, White Wealth. I like Claude Anderson because he's very good at history and how history has been used to affect Black people financially. Now, the only thing I guess that I have the knock on him, which doesn't apply to this book, but just in general, is that some of the solutions, it's basically, you know, his solutions kind of center around not having government assistance, which is fine, but it's as we described, it's hard, and no other group has had to fend for themselves. No other group has had to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. Bootstraps are only for Black people, and we need to quit trying to start businesses. We need to quit trying to compete with white companies that have help that we don't think we need. If that makes sense. Like I know a lot of entrepreneurs, and when I try to talk to them about reparations, or when I try to talk to them about getting involved with their local politics, they're like, "Oh man, I'm not gonna worry about that." I'm a just like they think they can just battle the beast. They think that they can just fight white supremacy with hard work and wisdom, and you can't. And in order to uh, have our labor work for us, we're going to have to change some laws, because what works against us is the laws. It's not just individuals being racist. It's the laws itself. It's the government itself that's racist. However, this is still a good book because it talks about how our hard-earned or our hard work benefited others. And it's also a case for reparations. It's probably like the first book that I recommended, but it's a little bit thinner, but it's still good, and I still recommend it. And like I said, I still like Dr. Claude Anderson. Like I said, we do have some disagreements on the solutions, but I agree totally when it comes to diagnosing the problem. And so, great book to read. Um, I don't think I'll recommend that one. That one doesn't necessarily have to do with with reparations. I'll share it anyway. A book called White Woman's Rights. White Women's Rights by Louise Michelle Noonan. This book is probably closer to They Were Her Property, I would say. This book here, they probably go hand in hand. This talks about white women as slave owners, participants, active participants. And this kind of gives you a history on the feminist movement. But what they don't tell you a lot of times is that the creators of the feminist movement, supremely racist. Supremely racist. They don't tell you that feminism is actually a group for white women. And this is one of the things that gets me in trouble with a lot of my Black female friends, is I'm like, look, I agree, and I'm with you as far as fighting for women's rights and discrimination and things like that. I'm with you. I'm with you. But you got to understand that usually what Black women want and what white women want is two different things. And you got to understand that. And if you don't, this is a good book. It's a good book to read. Good book to read. And so, like I said, I share this because the only way we'll get reparations, and the only way that we'll ever be able to succeed, is if all Black people work together. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of, and I'll admit it does get me frustrated, is there's kind of like this gender war that goes on between some black women and some Black men, where it's just a back and forth. It's like an oppression Olympics. And I'll admit I've even fallen victim to it, but I am trying to change that, because we shouldn't really be going at each other, but it just gets so frustrating sometimes, because you know you're when you're a black man and you're trying to do the right thing, you generally surround yourself by other black men that are doing the same thing. So when you hear different groups, whether it be women or the black LGBT community, when you hear us use black men as scapegoats, it gets frustrating because it's like we're struggling just like everyone else. There's no black male privilege. That's a hoax. It's not true. It just isn't. We get treated bad because we're black first. Everything else, I'm not sure how significant it is if you're black. So I shared this to say, you need to understand a lot of these groups that you become involved with. If they're hostile about talking about black issues, if you're part of a feminist group or if you're part of a LGBTQ group, and they don't like to hear from the black voices and they don't have any black people in leadership roles, how useful is it? That's all I'm saying. So, like I said, not necessarily a book about reparations. However, it is a good book just to check out. How many? Oh, I said I had one book, but I actually have two. The New Jim Crow. New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, an expert in the field of mass incarceration, if you ask me. New York Times bestseller. Just goes into and we discussed Jim Crow before with one of the previous books where like I said, arbitrary rules were created just so black people can get locked up and work for free in prisons. And this is similar. This is talking about the new Jim Crow, which derives from the war on drugs, which was a way to basically lock up poor black people, get them locked up for life. That whole 3 strikes you're out, that's real. And a lot of black people got locked up because of it. And one of the things it focuses on is on how liberal America is complicit in this. Joe Biden, presidential candidate Joe Biden, he's the one that wrote the 94 crime bill. He was the co-author of it. That was his baby. So the same law that locked up damn near a tenth of a generation, that was his doing. And now he's trying to run for president and act like he didn't have any involvement with it. Why? Because he's ashamed, because we know now, 25 years later, 30 years later, that those laws affected black people disproportionately, specifically the men. You have black men locked up at astonishing rates. Throw in men who are on probation and house arrest and stuff like that. You're talking about a tenth of black men. A tenth. And there's no other group that can say that. But, a tenth of us is under the carceral state, yet we only make up about 6% of American society in general. That's a problem. That's a problem. Like this book talks about that. So when you hear us talking about reparations, we're not talking about just slavery. We're talking about an ongoing enterprise of systemic racism. We're not talking about something that happened 200 years ago. That's a part of it. But to act like that's the only thing that has hurt black people throughout the centuries, it's just not right. Just not right at all. And so, like I said, this talks about mass incarceration affecting, and this may make some people mad, but I'll go ahead and let you know. She even mentions in the book that mass incarceration disproportionately affects black men. So the book centers around black men. So if I know some people have a problem with any subject that deals with black men or speaking to the issues of black men. So if you're triggered by that, I would not recommend this book. However, if you do want to have a better understanding of it, if you're a father, and if you're a father with sons, I would definitely recommend this book. So, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, excellent book. And I finally got my last book here. And Oddly enough, this is a book I haven't finished yet. From Here to Equality. There we go. Uh, From Here to Equality by William A. Darity and A. Kristen Mullen. Um, I can't rave enough about Dr. Darity here. MIT graduate, professor at Duke, foremost expert on reparations, and that's not to take anything away from Kirsten Mullen. I'm not as familiar with her work. I do know some of it, but I do want to shout her out because obviously they're co-authors. So I want to shout out both people. However, I am more familiar with Dr. Darity's work, and like I say, if you know me, I'm highly critical. Okay, so if I'm telling you I put somebody up on a pedestal like this, man, that should let you know how serious I take it. So, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. I'm only maybe about 40 pages in, but there's so much information in here. I want to take my time with it. But I mean, it's an excellent book. It basically sums up all the rest of these into one. It gives you solutions. It tells you who qualifies. It tells you how much is owed, how we can go about accomplishing. I mean, one of the knocks on reparations is that, oh, well, we need to do a study first because we need to know more about it. It's like we've already studied it. We've already studied it. We have millions. I don't want to say millions, but we have so many books about, slavery, history, how America has used black free work to enrich itself. And there has to be some type of reparations for that. And it talks about how, reparations is not a new concept. America has paid reparations out before to other countries before. So this whole, well, where's the money gonna come from? That's a silly that's a silly clapback. But folks will hit you with it though. But the fact of the matter is we just seen the government give out about $3 trillion because of COVID-19, and that was about 3 months of inconvenience. 3 months of inconvenience, they come up with $3 trillion just out the blue. Nobody asked, hey, where'd this money come from, or how are we gonna pay for it? When it comes to these wars and these military installations all over the world, nobody ever says, hey man, who's paying for these billion-dollar airplanes and aircrafts and missiles and aircraft carriers and all this other kind of stuff, Hummers, all this stuff? Nobody ever asks how much it costs. But when it comes to reparations for black people, oh man, you got all the questions coming up. How are we going to pay for it? Who gets it? Do black people pay into it? Is it going to come out of taxes? Is it going to raise much? Like, we have all these questions to ask when it comes to reparations, but when it comes to other stuff, not so much. So, like I said, I haven't finished this book, so I can't give too much information on it, but just being familiar with Dr. Darity's work, I already know it's awesome. So I would recommend this book. And to be honest with you, you probably could just read this book first and then do the other ones, because it, just based off of what I read so far, it seems like it sums up a lot of these other books. So if you want to save time, maybe start with this one. However, once again, just want to say thank you all for coming out and checking out my video. I want to try to do more, but I got to get my life in order first. However, I just gave you quite a few books to read in the meantime, so I would say go ahead and check those out, because I think if you can understand these books and kind of see where I'm coming from, you would get less offended with some of the stuff that I say. I understand that I talk about controversial topics, but I do it so that I can take the heat from it, but you can learn. You don't have to be outspoken. You don't have to speak on these things, but I would recommend you at least know about them. I would recommend you at least be knowledgeable so you can at least tell your kids. because a lot of information that we get actually work against us, and that's where you get that term "stay woke" from. That's actually a term that was created for black people that we use for other black people. If we're going to talk about history, now it's been so bastardized, it don't have any meaning. Now woke is can apply to LGBT, women, immigration, climate change, all this other kind of stuff, when in actuality woke is pertaining specifically to black people. And like I said, it's a term that black people would use to other ones to kind of let them know, like, hey, you know, don't buy into this quote unquote American dream. We have not accomplished what America says it has. We have not accomplished equality, especially financial equality. You know, the wealth gap is vast, and we can't ignore that just because it's a handful of rich black guys, you know, or a handful of rich black people. Where sure, LeBron James got money. Sure, Bob Johnson got his money. Jay-Z, all these people have money, but that still doesn't. but that still doesn't offset the millions of black people that are worth less than $1. You got to figure these things, and in order to understand where you are and how you fit into America, you have to educate yourself. And you have to educate yourself while still centering your blackness. We learn about a whole bunch of history from a whole lot of other people, but we don't have a full grasp of our own knowledge. And that's what stay woke comes from. It's what we call a knowledge of self. We have how white people see us, and how white people see our problems, and what white people think are the solutions. But then you have black people that are showing us, like, hey, what they say our problems are and what our findings are telling us is two different things. Our findings are telling us that we're not poor. We're not collectively poor because we buy Jordans. You know what I'm saying? We aren't collectively poor because we don't work hard. We're collectively poor because we live in a country and in a system that has designated us to be the bottom group. We've been designated. Okay, and the only way to change that is through reparations, to where we can close the wealth gap. Now we have money to invest in ourselves. We can invest in homes. We can invest in our own businesses. Okay, we can have our own communities, like a little Italy or a Chinatown. We think of how many black people have lost out on $1 million ideas because we didn't have the money to sue, to pay for lawyers. Part of the reason Byron Allen was able to get Comcast to carry his channels is because he had the money to hire lawyers to fight for him. And I commend him for that. But we ain't got Byron Allen's pockets, okay? And so, like I said, that's why reparations are so important, because we need it. It's not optional. You know, we need those reparations so that we can participate in American life. So we don't have to fake it till we make it. We don't have to work ourselves to the bone and die in our 50s just so we can have just a little bit out of life, so we can enjoy just a little bit. You see what I'm saying? So once again, I don't want to make this video too long, even though it already is. You know how I do, but I'm working on it. However, like I said, I gave you all these books to read so that we can kind of learn our history, understand the country that we live in, and so we can make our decisions based off of information and not just anecdotes and basically lies. So this concludes our latest episode of Crafting Conversations. I actually had a blanket that I worked on. I wanted to show y'all, but it's in a different room. So I'm gonna have to show it to you next time. But once again, this is your boy Levon. I gave you a bunch of reading, and until next time, I'll holler at you.